There are many stages in life, many dimensions of reality. When someone passes away, is that the end? Or is there a continuation of consciousness? A consciousness that transforms and transcends. Remember, there is a divine presence within, a divine presence that is everlasting. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, a different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind, moving down the line, return to the divine. Sad to see them go, but wipe that weeping eye. They are not alone, they have returned to the Most High. Yes, that breath of life that enters you and me returns to the source like a river to the sea. Flesh returns to earth, water turns to water. Essence of thy soul returns to the Creator. Memories will always stay. There's a part of you can never pass away. So hold your head up, hold your head up high. Don't give up, wipe that weeping eye. Just live up. You got to realize there are many stages in life. Wow, 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 wow. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, a different kind of world, a different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind, moving down the line, return to the divine. When a baby is born, the baby starts to cry. Thrust into this new world and they don't know why. They've waved the old world bye-bye. A brand new adventure has entered into their lives. Remember the good times and the happiness they give. Deep into your heart they will always live. The good things that you do will surely follow you. Strive for righteousness and you must get through. The body might be gone but the soul it can live on. Signaling the start of a brand new dawn. A new concert, a new stage. Turning over a new page. So hold your head up, hold your head up high. Don't give up, wipe your weeping eye. Just live up, you got to realize there are many stages in life. Why, 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 why?
Vibration, transformation.
It's a spiritual vibration. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, a different kind of mind. Sad to see them go, wipe that weeping eye. They are not alone, they have returned to the Most High. Yes, that breath of life that enters you and me returns to the source like a river to the sea. Flesh returns to earth, water turns to water. Essence of thy soul returns to the Creator. Memories will always stay. There's a part of you can never pass away. So hold your head up, hold your head up high. Don't give up, wipe that weeping eye. Just live up, you got to realize there are many stages in life. Why, 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 why? It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind, moving down the line, return to the divine.
Say warmest greetings, sisters and brothers, and welcome to the Pan-African People's Phone. The Pan-African People's Phone is a space for free, interactive discussions conducted over the internet. From time to time we will have guests interacting as part of the program. The themes will be dealt with in the program on the level, on the vibe of Pan-Africanism. Revolutionary Pan-Africanism will be the kind of guiding ideology of the discussions that you'll hear in these in this set of programs. So every Monday here on Bless Radio 1, you will be able to listen to Pan-Africanist-based discussions starting at 8 p.m. This is the time in England, the time in Britain, the time in what some people call the UK, starting at 8 p.m. and going on until 10 p.m. As things stand at the moment, the program is operating by itself, but we are going to be populating the airwaves, if I can put it that way, starting at least from 6 o'clock. So you're going to have a full evening of listening here on Bless Radio. We're coming up very soon. But for now, you're going to be having between 8 and 10 the Pan-African People's Phone In. My name is Omowale Rupatemru. A lot of people call me Brother Omowale, and I'll be facilitating this program here on Bless Radio. Now, in this evening's program, we're going to be focusing on a book. Actually, I'm the author of the book, and the book is going to form part of a program of study for a number of different organizations here in Britain. Eventually, I'm hoping that this book will form part of a program of study for Pan-Africanist organizations around the world, a means of inducting new people into a proper understanding of what Pan-Africanism is. The name of this book is Pan-Africanism From Program to Philosophy, subtitled An Outlook on Liberation. And what I'll be doing is I'll be working from this book in today's program. I'll actually read from the book in today's program, and people will be free to ring in, to interact, to share their ideas in relation to what's being discussed, and generally to join in what I hope will be an interactive program. Now, we begin the program in the African tradition. In the African tradition, we always remember our ancestors. And so we'll be beginning with what we call the libation corner. The libation corner will be supported by the music that you're going to hear me just play now. When you hear this music, it means that we're in the libation corner. So this music will represent the libation corner. This will be the part of the program where we honor our ancestors. And the liberation achievements of some of our ancestors, and we'll be looking at the liberation achievements of our ancestors that are relevant to this period of the year, this particular week of the year that we're in. What I will do is I will share libations, just acknowledging achievements of African people that have happened during the equivalent of this week over however long a period. And what I'm asking of sisters and brothers who are listening is if you have a loved one that has recently passed, and you want to have that loved one acknowledged in the libation corner, I want you to feel free, not just free, but welcome to ring in and have your loved one acknowledged during the libation corner. But also, if it is the anniversary of the passing of a loved one, then again you're invited to ring in and have your loved one acknowledged during the libation corner. So I'll be sharing a few, not many, but a few African historical anniversaries at this time. And if you feel you want to join in, ring in, and all that will happen is I will stop what I'm saying. I will allow you to make your contribution in the libation corner to honor your ancestor. And then after you've concluded, I will resume with the libation that I'm sharing, or with the acknowledgements that I'm sharing. So please feel free to ring in. Let's give the number, the studio number, for anybody who may want to ring in and interact with the libation corner. The number for interaction is 07 944 313 66. That's 07 944 313 66. That's the number for the libation corner if you feel that you want to ring in to have your ancestor acknowledged. 07 944 313 66. It's always useful to have a pencil and paper handy if you're not familiar with the number, just so that you can make a note of that number and ring in and interact. So in the libation corner today, let's remember today is the 2nd of December 2019. And on the 2nd of December 1884, one of our ancestors by the name of G.T. Woods patented his telephone transmitter. The African people were involved in the science that brought telephones into existence. And so we acknowledge our ancestor at this time, our ancestor G.T. Woods. Moving forward to the 3rd of December. And this time we go back just to the year 1976. Many of us listening were actually alive during this period. In 1976, on the 3rd of December, Bob Marley, Rita Marley, and their manager Don Taylor were shot and wounded in Kingston, Jamaica. So there was an attempt on Bob Marley's life in 1976. Thankfully, he survived. Thankfully, Rita Marley and Don Taylor also survived. But we remember the attempt to take Bob Marley from us. Moving forward to the year 1999 again, many of us were alive during this period of history. We note that one of London's newspapers, or one of England's newspapers in fact, The Guardian is the newspaper, it reported that Bob Marley's song, One Love, had been chosen as the anthem for the millennium by the BBC. So the BBC chose a Bob Marley rhythm, One Love, as the anthem for the millennium. That is an outstanding achievement. Can you imagine that? And an African achieving this, adjudicated by Europeans. It's difficult to believe in many respects that somebody in the BBC on this occasion had a little bit of sense, and Bob Marley's rhythm, One Love, became, according to the BBC, the anthem for the whole millennium, not the decade, not the century, but the millennium. The decade it's not the year, which is 1 year. It's not the decade, which is 10 years. It's not the century, which is 100 years. It is the music, the rhythm of the millennium, the music of 1,000 years, moving from the year 1000 to the year 2000. A remarkable achievement. Moving on to the 4th of December, this time we go back to the year 1888. And in the year 1888, one of our ancestors, F. Wynne, his name is spelled Wynne, W-I-N-N, F. Wynne patented his direct acting steam engine. So we were involved in all of the new technological developments of the time, because the steam engine was what was used to power trains and locomotion. It became a very important part of what we do, and those that have studied the history of Kemet will be aware that in Kemet, that's ancient Egypt, steam was used, but steam engines were not used to power locomotion. We had developed steam engines, but we used them to open and close concrete doors. So what we used to do is we had steam engines. We had developed steam engines thousands of years ago, but we had not put it together with the wheel. And so the steam engines that we developed, the combustion was used to open heavy concrete slab doors, which could not otherwise be moved. And of course to close them again. So African science has been at the forefront, and our ancestors have been at the forefront of scientific development, not just in the last century or the century before, but millennia upon millennia before.
I don't know what to do with myself.
Moving forward to the 5th of December, the 5th of December 1955 this time. And we remember the Montgomery boycott. Last week we remembered the great Rosa Parks, who refused to sit at the back of the bus in Montgomery. Well, on the 5th of September, 4 days after that refusal, the boycott was launched. 45,000 African people in USA organized, and they organized carpools. They walked to work rather than went on the bus to work. And they launched a campaign which lasted a year. In fact, it was a little bit more than a year. It was 382 days it lasted. And that campaign eventually brought the Montgomery Bus Company to its knees. And that company then had to come groveling back to African people, begging African people, please come and use our bus. We won't put you at the back of the buses anymore. We hit them in their pocket, taught them a lesson. And there are lessons there for us to learn and apply today. So we remember the ancestors who sacrificed as part of the Montgomery bus boycott to make US Satan just marginally more tolerable for African people. And as we move forward to the 6th of December, and this time we go back to the year 1932, and there will be some elders among us who were alive at this point, because those people will be in their mid-80s now. In 1832, one of our ancestors, R.B. Stokes, patented the automatic gear shift. So when we drive our cars, some of us use manual gears. Others among us have automatic gears. Well, it was an African that invented the automatic exchange or gear exchange system. And so we have to remember our ancestors and their contribution. One of the problems with all of these contributions that we make is that we do not make them for the advancement of Africa and our people, but we make them for the advancement of our enemy. And our enemy use our great talent to further themselves and make life better for themselves. And now the final contribution that I'm going to make in the Libation Corner this week goes to the 7th of December. And in 1954,
because ever since the day you left,
F.M. Jones, one of our ancestors, patented the method for air conditioning. Can you imagine that he patented the method for air conditioning? That became something which became very popular in USA. And in Africa, this is an African man that created it, and in Africa, air conditioning hardly exists even today. It was non-existent more or less in those days, but it hardly exists even today. And again on the 7th, we remember another of our ancestors, this time going back to the year 1896, J.T. White, who patented the lemon squeezer. So those are the contributions that I'll be making to the Libation Corner for this week. I hope if you had an ancestor, even if you did not ring in, if you had an ancestor, I hope, or if you have an ancestor who maybe passed at this time of year or who recently passed, I hope that you held them in your memory. Now, before we move into the program proper, let's hear just one more rhythm, and then we'll move into the book.
Oh, what a day, oh. Ooh, what a day, oh. Say what a day, oh, yeah. I'm tired of the hunger I see on people's faces, tired of the animosity between the races, tired of corruption in high and low places, and bricks with money but no social graces, tired of being judged for the style in my hair, and the music that I listen and the clothes that I wear. I'm tired of life and death being sold as a pair, and politicians who keep saying they care, but maybe hoping for a change is a dream. And maybe life ain't as bad as it seems, but if dreaming is the best I can do, then I'll be dreaming my whole life through. Oh, what a day when war becomes a thing of the past, and peace we will have it at last, and life is finally worth its cost. And whoa, 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 what a day when men finally live what they teach, and love ain't just a concept we preach, and blood no longer runs in the streets. Whoa, 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 what a day. Tired of leaving church feeling like I just been robbed. 2 hours of rambling, not much mention of God. The richest man's the only one who does not have a job. A bunch of righteous freaks extorting worse than a mob, y'all. Tired of baby mama, tired of baby daddy, chilling in the spot where the parents should be. Teenage mother saying leave my business alone. In 20 years a kid could be robbing my home, but I got a vision of a whole other plane, where the spiritual can flourish again. I'm just waiting for the fire to rain, burn down everything and start clean. What a day when war becomes a thing of the past, and peace we will have it at last, and life is finally worth its cost. And whoa, 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 what a day when men finally live what they teach, and love ain't just a concept we preach, and blood no longer runs in the streets. And whoa, 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 what a day, oh. Ooh, what a day, oh, what a day, oh. What a day, what a day, what a day. Ooh, oh, Maybe hoping for a change is a dream. Maybe life ain't as bad as it seems. But if dreaming is the best I can do, then I'll be dreaming my whole life through. Oh, what a day when war becomes a thing of the past, and peace we will have it at last, and life is finally worth its cost. And whoa, 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 oh, and unity ain't just a word in our vocabulary. I'll help you even when there ain't nobody to see. You can believe in me. Whoa, what a day when war becomes a thing of the past, and peace we will have it at last, and life is finally worth its cost. And whoa, 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 oh, what a day when men finally live what they teach, and love ain't just a concept we preach, and blood no longer runs in the streets. And whoa, 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 oh, what a day when, whoa, what a day when, ooh, what a day when, oh, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day.
Ukombozi's approach to Pan-Africanism. Now, Ukombozi is the name of an organization, but it is at the same time in the Swahili language the word for liberation. So when you hear the term Ukombozi, it means liberation. Now it's an organization that I founded, as is the organization Pan-African Society Community Forum, which I founded more than a decade ago now. And organizations that I'm linked with will be following or applying, I should say, the ideas in this and some of the other books that I'll be sharing. To get a copy of the book, by the way, if you really want to engage with this conversation. But anyway, Ukombozi's approach to Pan-Africanism is the chapter heading. Section 1.1 is the general stance of Ukombozi, the general stance of the said organization. 1.11 heading 1.11 is entitled Statement of Philosophy. And I'm going to read as follows. Ukombozi is a philosophical materialist organization. We in Ukombozi seek to be a disciplined unit in the broader, centrally coordinated revolutionary Pan-African movement. We stand for revolutionary Pan-Africanism, which works for the unification and liberation of Africa and African people under a just social system. That just social system is called scientific socialism. The achievement of this objective is our contribution to the worldwide revolutionary movement. We recognize that until this objective is achieved, African men will remain doubly oppressed on grounds of race and fundamentally on the basis of class, whilst African women who suffer additional gender oppression will continue to be triply oppressed. So we're saying that African women are oppressed on the grounds of their sex. They're oppressed on the grounds of the fact that they're African, so they experience sexism, they experience racism, but they also experience classism, in that most of us are among the poorer people in the world. I know we got the odd millionaire there, the odd millionaire here or there, the odd billionaire possibly even here and there, but the masses of our people are among the poorest people on earth. And so we suffer, our women suffer triple oppression, and our men suffer double oppression. Explain words which can sometimes present a barrier to communication. But reading on, we recognize that African people had a long, proud history before enslavement. However, since European imperialism came to Africa, African people suffered mass enslavement and exploitation. They have taken the forms of chattel slavery and colonialism, and continue until today as neo-colonialism. Ukombozi exists to help develop among African people and others a comprehensive understanding of the truth about the history and contemporary maangamizi or maafa that has affected African people. Now, because these are Swahili words, I will explain. The maangamizi, well, let me start with the maafa. The maafa is like the great Holocaust. It's like the great disaster. It's like the great accident. It's almost like a tornado has swept across us and caused great destruction, death and destruction among us as a people. So when we think of the maafa, it was initially applied to the enslavement era of our history, to describe the genocide that we suffered as a people at the hand of our European imperialist enemy. But what later transpired was those who were more learned in the Swahili language felt that it was not exactly the appropriate word, that maafa was not exactly the appropriate word because it was more akin to natural disaster, whereas what we were put through during the enslavement era was anything but natural. It was disaster. It was death and destruction. It was even dehumanization. But it was calculated. It was done deliberately. There were people who came to our land with a deliberate agenda of enslaving us, of committing genocide against us, of stealing the resources that are ours, and of covering their tracks through lies. And so the word felt to be more appropriate for that in the Swahili language is maangamizi. Maangamizi. So when you hear the terms maafa and maangamizi, they are being applied particularly to the enslavement era of our history. But the maangamizi, the maafa, continues to the present day, because the issues that we faced in slavery have not been resolved. Some of them have changed form, so that we don't necessarily have to wear physical chains, many of us or most of us. But the issue of ill treatment, exploitation, unfairness, injustice, and all of those associated concepts, those issues have not been resolved. So when you hear the term maangamizi, maafa, it refers in the first instance to the evils that impacted us during the enslavement era, but it also applies to the colonial era and the current neo-colonial era, because these problems have not been solved. Continuing on, this will make a contribution to addressing the injustices faced by African people today as a result of the continuing legacy of chattel enslavement. Our increased consciousness will propel us towards taking the actions necessary to seize control of our motherland and liberate ourselves from the exploitation of imperialism. Since taking control of our motherland can only be achieved through the control of state power, we acknowledge our duty to contribute to establishing an African continent-wide state power structure controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers as a critical provisional step towards Africa's total liberation. Let me say warmest greetings to you, sister or brother. You are live on Bless Radio. How would you like to contribute to this the discussion this evening?
Well, the problem is that the sound quality is terrible, and there's something in the background, so it's spoiling your show.
My brother, I want to thank you. That I call this technical assistance, and I'm very grateful to you.
Yeah.
The
And now
engineers
your
are hearing what you're saying, yeah, and I hope that the engineers will take up that point. Now, can you give a description of the kind of interference that you're hearing, my brother?
Sounds like you got a CD stuck, and it's just stuck, and this is from the start of the show. Now we have lost your microphone. When you came back after that song, the microphone has gone very low.
Right, so you're having difficulty hearing me speak as well, my brother, is that right?
Well, I have to listen very closely to hear you.
Okay.
And it's not good quality at all, but I just thought you might like to know.
I really appreciate your intervention, my brother. Can you hear me any better now?
Well, I'm speaking to you on the... I'm not listening to the radio now.
I see. So you're able to... yeah.
So I don't know what the radio's doing now, but I can hear you loud and clear now.
Now, I'm going to ask you if you kindly just hold the line for a little while. We have an engineer who is working on this as we speak.
I will ring you back because I can't listen to the radio and speak to you. Because I'm using the phone to listen to you.
Thank you very much, my brother. I understand exactly, and I thank you for ringing in. I thank you for making a note of the number and ringing in. Thank you for your technical assistance, my brother.
I got the flyer.
Oh, okay.
The flyer for the show, and I have it. That's how I know you're on. How long have this show been going?
This is the third week, including the test programs. This is the third week, my brother.
Okay, well, I'll spread the flyer around and spread the word.
Thank you very much. Your help and
You
assistance
do know,
is much
you
appreciated.
do know, you do know who's speaking, don't you?
I cannot say that I do at this time, I'm afraid.
Well,
I'm getting a sense of your voice, actually.
yes, Ken.
Oh, yes, greetings, my brother. Yes, yes, warmest greetings to you, my brother, and I thank you for
Greetings.
ringing in and interacting.
I thoroughly enjoy your shows, and I missed you terribly when you were gone. Now that you're back on, I'll be listening every Monday.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that support. Love and respect to you, my brother.
All right.
Yes,
Take care.
Take care.
Yeah.
So we thank our brother for ringing in, for looking or listening out for us. I mean, these type of calls, which are not about the subject matter, are actually very important, so that we understand if there are technical issues. It gives us an opportunity to do what we can to resolve those technical issues. So I think one of the things that I will do right now, I don't know if that's going to make any difference. I'm just doing a couple of things at the moment, and I hope that those adjustments that I've just made will make a difference. I think it possibly has made a difference. I'm getting a sense that the CD type interference noise is no longer there, and perhaps sisters and brothers will help by letting us know whether the mic quality has improved as well. So let's continue. We're going to continue. Let me just get a sense of where I was. We recognize that African people. Let's continue. We recognize that African people had a long and proud history before enslavement. However, since European imperialism came to Africa, African people have suffered mass enslavement and exploitation. They have taken the forms of chattel slavery and colonialism and continue until today as neocolonialism. Ukombozi exists to help develop among African people and others a comprehensive understanding of the truth about the historical and contemporary Maangamizi Kamaafa. This will make a contribution to addressing the injustices faced by African people today as a direct result of the continuing legacy of chattel enslavement. Our increased consciousness will propel us towards taking the actions necessary to seize control of our motherland and liberate ourselves from the exploitation of imperialism. Since taking control of our motherland can only be achieved through the control of state power, we acknowledge our duty to contribute to establishing an African continental-wide state power structure controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. And this is a critical step towards Africa's total liberation. African workers must achieve their own state power base, because if we have state power, we can do what we need to do. But by contrast, if we don't have state power, then hostile third parties in control of that state power can block us from doing the things that we need to do to achieve our liberation. And worse than that, they can compel us to submit to their will. In Britain, we will contribute to the struggle by combating the racist oppression perpetrated against us by the state, indigenous and other institutions, and the individuals that people them. Moving on to section 1.12, entitled Constituency, Principles and Operational Objectives. So this is to give us a sense of what Ukombozi or similar Pan-Africanist organizations in part of the world like Britain might be focusing the direction they may be focusing their energy. So it says here, Ukombozi is an organization for African people regardless of where they were born or their spiritual or religious persuasion. Its purpose is to bring African people together in order to, one, collaborate with other groups to realize the interests of African agricultural and industrial workers. Two, work in unity to overcome modern-day slavery, which has now taken the form of neocolonialism and institutional racism in places like Britain, for instance. Three, learn from past victories and setbacks during our victory over chattel slavery and colonialism. You see, we had some serious victories during the enslavement era. We had some serious victories during the colonial era. And the lessons that we've learnt from those can be applied today to ensure that we have a massive victory in this, the neocolonial era. When we've successfully defeated neocolonialism, we will move into a new phase of history. That phase of history is actually called socialism. So socialism is an historical phase at the same time as it is a socio-political economic system. And four, we're coming together to intensify our efforts for total liberation, recognizing the primacy and centrality of Africa and the need for Africa's political unification and unification of African people, wherever they may be in the world, throughout the continent itself and in the diaspora. And all of this is to be done through an African continental-wide state power structure controlled by Africa's agricultural and industrial workers. So we're now just setting out, if you like, a kind of a template for moving forward. I was in a meeting yesterday where I was asked, what is my solution? Individuals cannot solve the problems of Africa. It is us collectively that can solve the problems of Africa. But the first chapter of this book is an attempt to give an overview of strategy, an outline of strategy that can help us to move towards liberation. So continuing, the minimum principles of Ukombozi include, this is not everything, but the minimum principles include the following. Number one, an anti-imperialist and anti-neocolonialist stance. Two, no support for current governments in Africa or main political parties in Britain and the anti-African state structures that they uphold and perpetuate. So, as Pan-Africanists, we are not here to try and, make the Conservative Party, the government of this country, or the Labour Party, the government of this country, or the Liberal Democrats, the government of this country. We are seeking the power of African people to govern ourselves in our continent. And what that means is when we are powerful in our continent, and that government is a genuine people's government, that government can then offer protection to those of us who are living as minorities in foreign lands like Britain, foreign lands like US Satan is another example. So at the moment we suffer from problems like, for instance, deaths in custody. Police could just go around killing us, and they have no compulsion. Nothing stops them, frankly. They seem to do it as a sport. It seems to be the new sport. Let's go kill African people. And the neocolonial governments in Africa do nothing to defend us. the neo-colonial governments in the Caribbean do nothing to defend us. But in a new state, a new phase of history, where Africa is strong, no one will be able to attack Africans, even here in Britain, because the fear of retaliation from Africa would be too great. So when there was a time when Chinese used to come under serious attack, but now the fear of the power of China is such that they have to be very careful. You don't hear about Chinese dying in police custody here in Britain, because they know that China is powerful. Don't mess with China. And when we become powerful, we will be far more powerful than China. And it will be don't mess with Africa. And it is that power which is going to protect us. So continuing on, point number 3, self-determination for African people based on African continental-wide state power structures controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. And it's important to understand that we must control the state. State power is, in a nutshell, the most potent power in a nation other than the people of that nation organized. So those who control state power really, they're the Dungargan of the nation. And our job is to be the Dungargan of our nation. We're not trying to rule other people's nations, but Africa is ours, and we have to rule Africa. Point number 4, a recognition that the interests of Africa's agricultural and industrial workers are the guiding force for the African liberation struggle. So we're not doing this to make the rich people in Africa richer. We're doing this for all African people, so that all of the poor people of Africa at the moment become rich people. So that African people become rich people wherever we are in the world, whether we're in Africa or whether we're overseas in the diaspora. So, you know, we're not pandering to the needs of the few rich Africans. We are working, or the wants, I should say, of a few rich Africans. We are working to satisfy the needs of the masses of poor African people. And when we do that, the world will be a better place. And the 5th point in this one is the continuous and conscientious work towards the elimination of exploitation of people by people from the world. And this means promoting 3 cardinal principles. The first of those cardinal principles is humanism. In a nutshell, humanism can be described as people before profit, or people before property, or people before money. It is treating people with respect for no reason other than the fact that they are human beings. That's all you need to be treated with respect. This is the essence of humanism. The second of those principles is egalitarianism. And egalitarianism says that we are all equal in essence. That all human beings are equal in essence. That the able-bodied is equal in essence to the disabled, and vice versa. That the woman is equal in essence to the man, and vice versa. That the African is equal in essence to the Asian, the European, the American Indian, etc., 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 and vice versa in all instances. This is the essence of egalitarianism. And let me just say this, that egalitarianism must be distinguished from another concept which is called equalitarianism. You see, equalitarianism exists where, let me give an example actually, let me just do it this way. Equalitarianism says that everybody must have size 5 shoes. And what that means is that everybody gets a pair of shoes and everybody's shoes is size 5. But equalitarianism doesn't work because not everybody has feet that fit into a size 5 shoe. Egalitarianism says that everybody should have shoes that fit their feet. And so the difference between equalitarianism and egalitarianism is that egalitarianism is about making sure that people get their fair share of resources. It makes sense for somebody who is a wheelchair user to have a wheelchair, and for others who don't need the wheelchair not to have one. That makes complete sense. That's within the remit of egalitarianism. But equalitarianism would say, well, if one person's got a wheelchair, then everybody should have one. There's a difference between the two concepts. So in Ukombozi, we stand for egalitarianism. This is fair shares, the sharing of resources, fairly and justly among the people. But the other side of that is that we give our talents, which are not necessarily equal in the equalitarian sense. We give our talents as best we can to the collective and receive from the collective our just rewards for doing so. And the third of those guiding principles, those cardinal principles, is called collectivism. And the essence of collectivism is we before me. That the collective is superior to the individual. Now, let's be clear. You cannot have a collective without individuals. You can't have a collective without individuals. But you can't have individuals without a collective. But the reason we know that the collective is superior is that collectives create individuals. But individuals cannot create collectives. In fact, individuals cannot even create themselves. The collective that creates us, and this is true for all of us, was our parents. Our parents created us, brought us into being, and in order for us to bring other human beings into being, we must form a collective with an appropriate partner. So moving on. The operational objectives of Ukombozi. So now we're looking at the objectives of a Pan-Africanist organization. The operational objectives of Ukombozi include: 1. Providing truthful information about the African Maangamizi/Ma'afa to trigger and enhance our quest for African continent-wide state power structures controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. 2. Providing a platform for Africans in the front line of the struggle to achieve an African continent-wide state power structure controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. 3. Strengthening unity in action amongst African organizations and individuals working towards an African continental-wide state power structure controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. 4. Countering the British government's negative propaganda programs against African people as we strive to achieve an African continent-wide state power structure controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. I mean, all of the points are very important, but this propaganda point is one we should bear in mind. We're working, through a radio medium you know, right now. And one of the things that happens systematically in the media here in Britain is African people are vilified. African youth are presented as though we are criminals. African youth are associated with negative aspects of society. The truth is that we make contributions to this society which are very positive. There may be you know, small sections of our youth who are engaged in negative activity. But there are much larger sections of our youth actually who are studying very hard, who are studying hard at school, who are studying hard at university. Many of our people have been working for years, giving their labour in service of this country. We of course hope that they will give their labour in service of Africa and our liberation. This is a bone of contention on one level, but the point that's being made is that there's propaganda around African people in Britain, negative propaganda against African people in Britain, which is far from the truth of our experience and contribution here in this particular part of the world. In fact, it goes even further than that. This country is built on the blood of African people. Maybe another subject for another time, but we have to make the point. And the fifth of the points under objectives is campaigning against the injustices suffered by African people, particularly in Britain, but also around the world. You know, some of the symptoms of that include things like, for instance, the exclusion of African children from the state school system or schooling system. This is an attempt to de-skill African children, to render African young people unemployable, to make sure that we can't read and write. Remember, one of the critical differences between a human being and an animal, it's not the only difference, but it's one of the critical differences, is the ability to read and write. No animal other than human beings has the capacity to read and write. And so when you deprive a human being of the opportunity to learn how to read and write, it's a tactic to hold them down at the animalistic level. And so when our children are thrown out of school through what they call exclusions, when they expel our children from school, one of the things that they're doing is they're trying to hold our children down to the animalistic level. Looking at paragraph now, or section now, 1.13. Demands and programs. So let me look here, or let me share here a list of demands and program of Ukombozi or similar Pan-Africanist organizations based in somewhere like Britain. Because of course the particulars of demands will vary according to where in the world we are. We're not all demanding precisely the same thing. We have central themes in common. We want a liberated Africa. We want an Africa controlled by African people. This is central to Pan-Africanism everywhere. But there are particularities that African people will be demanding in their localities based on their circumstances. In some places we're the majority, that's most of Africa. The Caribbean is another example. In other places we're actually the minority, and that will impact the kinds of demands that we make. So it says here, we demand 1. An end to sexual discrimination and the exploitation of women. You see, if our women are not free, if our women are not liberated, none of us are free. We all come into this thing that we call life, we all come into it via woman. There's no other way to get into this thing called life. So if the very being that brings us into existence is not free, then it's impossible for the rest of us to be free. We can't be free and our source unfree. The second point, an end to the contemporary Maangamizi stroke Ma'afa systematically carried out against African people in Britain and around the world, including an end to, and I'll list the things that I said here. 1. The state-sponsored terror campaign currently being carried out against African youth. 2. The imposition of racist education on African children. 3. The imposition of the drug economy on African youth. 4. The shorter life expectancy and poor health structurally imposed on the African community. 5. The British state's systematic abuse of African people seeking entry into Britain as asylum seekers or immigrants. 6. Police brutality up to and including the murder of innocent African people. 6. Judicial corruption and bad practices. 7. The overrepresentation of African people among the homeless and poorly housed sections of society. 8. The overrepresentation of African people amongst the unemployed and those badly treated in the workplace. 9. The overrepresentation of African people among those incarcerated in the penal system. And 10. The overrepresentation of African people among those incarcerated in mental hospitals. So this gives you a sense of some of the challenges that we as Pan-Africanists have to confront. And those are challenges that we would think of particularly here in Britain. There will be different strands of the same those same challenges in other parts of the world, in Africa and other parts of the world. But continuing on, the next demand is full public exposure of all plans to perpetrate the Maangamizi Ma'afa against African communities in Britain and around the world. Let's expose what they're up to. This is very important. Full public exposure, the next point, full public exposure of all of the elements of the attempt to cover up the Maangamizi suffered by African people. So there is this attempt to pretend and deny that the suffering of African people exists at all. To deny that the suffering of African people is not just the suffering, it's the deliberate attack on African people. There's this deliberate attempt to pretend that it's not real. We demand full exposure of all of that. Continuing on, that the British government make an open written apology to African people for the Maangamizi stroke Ma'afa that it has perpetrated against us. Yes, they do need to apologise. When we say this, we're not begging for an apology, by the way. We're just making it clear what they have to do. The next point, full criminal proceedings to be carried out against all state officials who have colluded to wage that Maangamizi stroke Ma'afa against African youths and adults. The next point, that full criminal proceedings be carried out against all imperialist states and all state officials who colluded with miscarriages of justice against African people. The next point, full reparations for all African people everywhere in the world for the Maangamizi inflicted upon our ancestors and us now, actually, even to this day, by our imperialist enemy. So that was a list of demands which would be very typical of the kinds of demands that we would expect from a genuine Pan-Africanist organisation. Now, Ukombozi's program currently operates in three interrelated complementary elements. Firstly, we organize, lead, and work collaboratively with other groups campaigning against racist oppression of African people and other exploited peoples, including, the campaigns include deaths in custody and DNA campaigns to counter anti-African police brutality. Secondly, we collaborate to organize major African community events. In the past, we've done things like African Liberation Day, the Marcus Garvey African Family Day, Nkrumah at 100 commemoration, and Kwanzas. So organizations that I've been involved in, including Ukombozi, including the Pan-African Society Community Forum, and others, have been involved in these kinds of major community events. So that's an important part. And thirdly, we organize regular workshops aimed at raising the level of consciousness in the African community as a stimulus to positive action. So yesterday, I was actually involved in a workshop organized primarily by Sankofa 360, but Ukombozi and the Pan-African Society Community Forum did, of course, support that workshop, and that will be one of many to come. Of course, there have been many before, and that now kickstart a second process of workshops, and I think over the next year we're going to see much more activity coming, particularly from Sankofa 360. Now, moving on to section 1.2, that is entitled the Global Constituency and Land Base. So the global constituency and land base of Pan-Africanism, in other words. Section 1.21 is the dispersal of African people around the world. So we've got to get a sense of where we are located in the world. You know, how many of us are where in order to build a proper strategy of liberation. So let me read here. In 2016, Africa had a population slightly in excess of 1.2 billion people. That is 1,200 million people. That number has gone up now. The last time I looked, which was about a month ago, that number has now gone up to 1.3 billion people, 1,300 million people, and this is on the continent of Africa. Now, for a range of historic and demographic reasons, there are a large number of African people outside Africa. One source lists the top 10 diasporan concentrations of African people as follows, and I'm going to share this with you. In Brazil, 80 million African people. In US Satan, 45 million African people. In Haiti, 9 million African people. In the Dominican Republic, next door to Haiti, 7.8 million people. In France, 5 million African people. In Colombia, 4.8 million African people. In Jamaica, 2.9 million African people. In Venezuela, 2.6 million African people. In Britain, 1.9 million African people. In Trinidad, 1.2 million African people. Although it appears to leave out some significant African populations, so for instance, in India and Cuba, there are reputed to be African populations in the region of 200 million and 7 million respectively, it does provide a useful indicator. We can reasonably conclude that the diasporan population is in the region of 350 million to 400 million African people, meaning that a quarter of our 1.6 billion, now approaching 1.7 billion, but let's say 1.6 to keep it simple, of our 1.6 billion African population is living outside of the continent. The wide dispersal of African people across many different nations has obvious implications for our need to organize, unify, and strategize on a global scale. An important task for Pan-Africanists is to practically analyze the current situation of our 1.6, pushing for 1.7 billion African people in their various locations around the world. This will help to assess how each group can most effectively contribute to the overall process of African liberation, developing on the analysis provided by Ilenga Mboyinga of the Union of the Peoples of Cameroon. The following categories are derived. Now, let me just say this, that Ilenga Mboyinga of the Union of the People of Cameroon, that organization was one of the leading forces of Pan-Africanism during the decolonization era. In the 1960s, they were one of the organizations that refused to accept the notion of borders in Africa. They sent their soldiers to various parts of Africa to fight for the liberation of Africa wherever they were needed. They really were the advance guard of the African Revolution, and they are their analysis wasn't casual. They did a real analysis of our people, and 5 categories develop out of their analysis. And so they say that category number one is African people who are the majority in the continental microstates. This is still the case in the majority of the continent and the entirety of the continent south of the Sahara. So in most places in Africa, African people constitute the majority. And they have taken that as one category, because when you're the majority, you have a particular opportunity to take hold of power if at this point in time we don't have it. So that's one category of African people. A second category of African people is African people who are in the minority in the continental microstates. So this speaks to the condition of African people in the northern area of the continent, North Africa, where in some of those states, African people are outnumbered by the Arab people who have come to be in occupation of that land. Category number 3, African people who are the majority in states in the Caribbean zone or in the Southeast Asian islands. Many people listening to this program will have a connection with the Caribbean. It's very obvious that African people are the majority in places like Jamaica, for instance, in places like Barbados, in Dominica, St. Lucia, Martinique, Guadeloupe. Martinique, Guadeloupe is slightly different because of their association with France. But if you go through the Caribbean islands, in almost all of those islands, African people constitute the majority, and it's important to acknowledge that fact. But one of the facts that is less well known is that if you go into Southeast Asia, if you go into islands like Borneo, for instance, like Tonga, for instance, what you see there are African people. You'll be amazed. They're African people, and they may not automatically call themselves African people, but you will see just looking at them, it's indisputable, it's undeniable that they're African people. So we have islands in Asia which hold a majority African population, and one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to make connections with our sisters and brothers in those islands. We've got to make connections with our sisters and brothers in Asia. And I know that there's one sister who has done a really excellent job. I won't name her because maybe it's not fair to say her name over the airways, but she's gone to India, for instance, and done work in India amongst the African population in India, even organising an African Liberation Day on one occasion. And what I may have to do is connect with her and ask her to come and just tell us about the great work that she actually did there. A fourth category that is identified is African people who are in the minority in the states that make up the imperialist heartlands. Now this applies to African people in Europe and North America. A case could be made for the inclusion of the Aboriginal people of Australia in this category. However, much would depend on how they collectively self-define. Now the Aborigines, which are a very interesting case in point, in the literature that I've read, they say that their history in Australia goes back 60,000 years, that they arrived in Australia 60,000 years ago. So it was Africans who were migrating and who went across Asia, and some of them went further across the seas and landed in Australia. And so the Aborigines of Australia, the Maoris of New Zealand, these are these are the Africans that went even further. And so it's about re-engaging them with their African roots. But they have been so decimated in their own land in Australia and New Zealand that now they form a minority in their own lands. And people like some of us, I live in Britain, we form a tiny minority here in Britain. In the world we are a large population, our 1.7 billion people. But in Britain we are a tiny minority. And so if we're planning a strategy of liberation, we must be clear on what the implications are for us as a minority in those foreign lands. This analysis also applies to US Satan, for instance. US Satan, where African people constitute around about 10% of the population. In Britain, we constitute about 2% of the population. So, our figure, our numbers are too small for us to suddenly decide that we're going to make revolution, for ourselves in these lands peopled by others. And the fifth category is African people who are a minority in near-colonial states in other continents. Now this applies to large numbers of African people in places like India, for instance, and in South America. Although it should be pointed out that within the South American zone there is Brazil, where African people constitute a majority of 60% of the population, but they lack political control. So, there has been a movement in Brazil amongst African people to recognize themselves as Africans. African people everywhere have been taught to be ashamed of their Africanness, and Brazil was no exception. And so you had many African people, particularly those who were mixed with other races, who went to great lengths to deny their Africanness. Increasingly they're beginning to accept it, and objectively they are the majority, 60% in Brazil. So each of these subgroups have slightly differing tactical roles to play in the overall strategy for pursuing African liberty, liberation and justice. Defining each of these tactical roles is a crucial and urgent task for Pan-African strategists in each of those zones. So this is the issue of the people and their location. The 1.7. Let me just take a step back on the figures side of it, by the way, and just to remember that 100 years ago there were 400 million African people in the world. We know this because Garvey told us this. Now we've got 400 million people in the diaspora alone. And Africa has got another 1.2 to 1.3 billion African people. So we need to understand the growth of our people. The growth of our people is the growth of our power. If only we can come to understand that. So moving on now to section 1.22, entitled African People's Legitimate Claim to Land Ownership. Now, an additional point directly related to the dispersal of African people around the world is the issue of which areas of land we can legitimately claim as our own. This question is crucial to establishing our power base along with the retrieval of those lands that have been stolen from us. There remains a level of confusion amongst us about what constitutes our legitimate land base. The approaches can be broken down into three broad categories. 1. The land south of the Sahara exclusively. It is of course an absurdity that African people should give up the northern part of the continent on the grounds that they are an oppressed minority in that section of the motherland. This notion fails the test of Pan-Africanism. So this idea that we must just parcel off North Africa to Arab people who are in the majority there is an anathema to Pan-Africanism. It is divisionism. It's the opposite of Pan-Africanism. The second of the categories is the whole African continent being exclusively for African people in the motherland. Now this is also referred to as continentalism. This notion excludes African people in the diaspora, and for that reason fails the test of Pan-Africanism by undermining our global unity. So Pan-Africanism is not continentalism. It's not, dividing the continent between the north and the rest. It's not continentalism. What is Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism, in terms of the unity element, is the third of the categories. And the third of the categories reads, the entire African continent forms our center of gravity, i.e. the continent is the land base for African people at home and abroad alike. So that the idea is that African land belongs to all of us as African people. Those of us who are at home, who are the custodians, but also those of us who are abroad, have our rights of return home. So continuing on, in parts of the world like the Caribbean, where we are outside Africa but constitute the majority population, we need to understand that the land does not truly belong to us. 1. That does not mean that we give up the land or pack up and leave. 2. We have occupancy rights similar to the way that tenants have rights in their homes. 3. We do not need to claim ownership of the land to exercise these rights. 4. In truth, the land belongs to the now almost extinct Carib people. Africa has 1.6 to 1.7 billion people throughout the world. It has the second largest landmass of all of the continents, which despite this is the richest land in the world by a long margin. So we've got the second largest landmass, but we've got the richest land. It is the combination of African people's labor combined with the wealth of the African soil that will be the salvation of Africa and the rest of the world. When we get Africa right, we will have made the first critical move to making the whole world right. The challenge before us is a challenge that will not only correct Africa, it will correct the whole world. Our success, that is our success as African people, is the success of the whole world. I'm going to move on to 1.3 now. Let's see if we get through 1.3 before the end of the program. Actually, let me just give out the number just in case anybody is interested in interacting in today's program. I'm happy to just continue. But if you want to interact, the number is 07 9444 313 66. It's always a good idea to grab hold of a paper and pen, you know, for note-taking purposes if you want to do it that way, but also to make a note of the number should you want to ring in and interact. And so I'll repeat that number. Maybe this is giving you an opportunity just to grab hold of a pen and a piece of paper. I'll repeat that number, and you should note that number down for future weeks. The number for interaction is 07 9444 313 66. So, continuing on, 1.3 is entitled The Three Origins of Pan-Africanism. Now, there are different perspectives on what constitutes the origins of Pan-Africanism. There are those who see it as coming into being as a result of the activities surrounding the first Pan-African conference organized by Henry Sylvester Williams in 1900. I heard a kind of a whistle there. That might mean that messages are coming through. I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to take messages at this time. I am in a position to take interaction if people want to come on air and make points. Others link its origin to African people's resistance to alien incursions into our continent. And yet others argue that it is as old as humanity and part of the organic development of Africa into a continental scale society. The truth is, all three tell an important part of the story of Pan-Africanism. They are all critical milestones in the development of Pan-Africanism. So 1.31, the natural progression towards Pan-Africanism. So let's look at this brief explanation. Africa was organically developing on its historical path towards continental unity. Certainly, in the initial phases, there were no outsiders, meaning it was free from external domination. Its principles and social systems were broadly just in that they were not based on exploitation. Communalism, the long-standing dominant social system, was developing into the early phases of feudalism in some parts of the continent. As part of that process, Africa was developing larger and larger political, economic and social aggregates. It developed from the family to the clan, to the tribe, to the nation, and even empires. Examples include, because I know some people like empires, examples include Ghana, that was an ancient empire of Africa. Mali, that was another ancient empire of Africa. Songhai, yet another. Zimbabwe, yet another. Mwanawatapa, yet another. There are plenty of other examples, but those are some of the well-known examples of ancient African empires. These were all signs of its organic progression towards a kind of continental unity. The organic development of African people to greater and greater aggregates is the unity element of Pan-Africanism. So that is the historic source, if you like, of the unity element of Pan-Africanism. Now, 1.32 is entitled The Disruption of Organic Pan-Africanism. Deals with a second milestone, and it reads as follows. The resistance aspect of Pan-Africanism began at the point at which people from outside of Africa invaded and stole our land. From that time onwards, African people have continuously resisted, with our purpose being the retrieval of every inch of our stolen land. Africa's development towards unity was interrupted by external invasions. The first documented successful invasion was by the Hyksos via Egypt in 1783 before the Common Era, BCE. It might be representative of this version's starting point for Pan-Africanism. That said, the notion of resistance might incorporate those attempted invasions which were successfully resisted, dating back much further. So we know that the Hyksos invaded and they were successful, quote unquote, in their invasion of Africa in 1783. But before that, lots and lots of attempts were made which we repelled, which we successfully fought off. And so when you're looking for the beginnings of this element of Pan-Africanism, the question becomes, do you start at the point at which a successful invasion was mounted, or do you start at the point at which invasions were mounted that were defeated? Arab imperialism was just as brutal and wicked to African people as European imperialism. However, it never managed to subdue and dominate us to the same extent that European imperialism did. Where Arabs currently control parts of our African soil, they do so under the hegemony of European imperialism. In other words, European imperialism runs the world. Resistance to external incursions is the liberation element of Pan-Africanism. So the first element that was introduced was the organic development element. This was the unity element. The second that we're speaking of here is the liberation element. When people try to invade you and the people have succeeded in invading you, you've got to repel them. This is the liberation element of Pan-Africanism. Remember the unification and liberation of Africa And we're coming to the third element. And the third element, 1.33, is entitled Organized Pan-Africanism, organized in inverted commas. Another milestone stroke origin of Pan-Africanism comes in the form of formal conferences and congresses, what some have referred to as organized Pan-Africanism. Du Bois' Pan-African Congresses really started by Henry Sylvester Williams in London in 1900, together with Garvey's UNIA conventions of the 1920s, well, and 30s actually. Sorry, no, it was the 1920s. His last one was 1928. And Padmore's Pan-African Federation of the 1930s were modern attempts to achieve continental-wide structures for Africa's liberation. Important to understand the significance of those conferences. Yeah? And so they took on a kind of a more overtly political stance. Now, the pinnacle of their activities was the 5th Pan-African Congress, which brought together those three competing tendencies. There were lots of arguments going on during that period of history. That's the early part of the last century, with Du Bois and Garvey had lots of intense arguments. They were later joined by George Padmore and CLR James, etc. They had lots of intense arguments about what is this Pan-Africanism. They were arguing about Pan-Africanism. And those arguments that they were having were part of what was forming and helping us to understand what the substance of Pan-Africanism is. And then what happened in 1945 in the 5th Pan-African Congress is all three of those tendencies came together. And they came together and formed an agreement around Pan-Africanism, which catapulted us and moved us forward. And just to emphasize the presence of those three tendencies, Marcus Garvey, by 1945, had passed. He passed in 1940, 10th of June, 1940, in fact. But his first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, participated in and chaired part of the activities. And his second wife, Amy Jakes Garvey, was intimately involved in the planning and participated through the Jamaican branch of the UNIA. George Padmore was the joint secretary of the Congress. And W.E. Du Bois was there, as I said, was present. And he was given a kind of a title. They called him at the time the father of Pan-Africanism. He did not have much power in that setup. But what was done is he was brought on board as part of the process of unifying. It was this Congress that spearheaded the process of African independence, what the imperialist enemy called the wind of change. During that Congress, Pan-Africanism formally declared its anti-imperialist and socialist credentials. The movement towards continental governance, coupled with the chosen political direction, explains the scientific socialist element of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is the outcome of the three components is an objective, which is the unification and liberation of Africa under scientific socialism. Pan-Africanism is an objective. So we see how the 3 points, the three pieces come together. You have Africa naturally, from the beginning of humanity, developing into greater and greater aggregates, into a continental scale entity. That was just a natural process. then you had that natural process interrupted by foreigners who invaded our lands and eventually reached a point where they subdued us in our own lands. And this is what ignited the liberation part of Pan-Africanism, because we had to liberate ourselves in order to realize that unity. So the unification and liberation of Africa. And the third part is when we started to put our heads together to try and make some, some ideological and philosophical and political sense, economic too, sense of what Pan-Africanism is. And when we had those conferences, we started to put our ideas together as to what Pan-Africanism is. And we came to the conclusion that to bring African principles back to the fore meant in the modern era, in the era of industrialization, that the socialist path was the path that we were bound to follow. You know, the socialist phase of history is the phase of history that we are seeking to move ourselves to, because that is the phase of history in which African principles will be dominant. And not only will they be dominant, but they will be dominant and supported by industrial technology. And when that happens, the world leaps forward on a scale that is difficult for us to imagine now. So those are the three elements. We've got a few minutes remaining still. So let me continue for now. Or I'm wondering, maybe I should come back to 1.4 next week, because there isn't going to be time to deal with all of 1.4 today in the remaining 10 minutes. Okay, let's just start it. We can always start it again next week if it comes to that. Let me just say the number for interaction in this evening's program is 07 9 444 313 66. Now, I'm not sure what the situation is this week. At the top of the hour, the presenter who we would be expecting would be Astamari. His program may be starting this week. It may be starting next week. I'm not absolutely certain because I've been away for a little while. But you may have our brother Astamari at the top of the hour at 10 o'clock. And he will be introducing his unified school of knowledge. But moving on to 1.4. 1.4 is entitled Sharpening the Focus of the Pan-African Objective. And 1.41, an expression of revolutionary aims. So reading on. The purpose of the revolution is to create a new social system, a better social system which brings tangible benefits to the masses of people whose situations it changes. It follows that world revolution must at the very least bring tangible benefits to the impoverished peoples of the world. The people of the world do not struggle for struggle's sake. Struggle is a means to an end, which facilitates a set of revolutionary outcomes and brings an expectation of one, the removal of exploitation everywhere in the world. 2, clear quality of life improvements for all African people of the world, manifested as happiness for the peoples of the world. 1.42 entitled Pan-Africanism, Our Revolutionary Objective. It reads, our Pan-African objective is the unification and liberation of Africa under a just social system, that is scientific socialism. This objective focuses our attention on 3 interrelated areas of operation. Firstly, achieving our unity as a people. Secondly, achieving our total liberation. And thirdly, establishing a just social system for the advancement of the interests of the vast majority of African peoples. Achieving these components will be the contribution of Africans to the creation of just social systems for all peoples everywhere in the world. It will be our contribution to the advancement of humanity. In the context of our current experiences, this objective directs us towards two simultaneous areas for priority action. Firstly, the re-establishment of African identity as a base for guiding our collective thinking and actions towards reaffirming the primacy of Africa. And secondly, the ongoing struggle against neocolonialism. There is still a high level of confusion amongst Africans, both at home and abroad, as to what exactly is an African. At the same time, we are being savagely ravaged by neocolonialism in Africa, in states outside of Africa, where we are the majority, and in the imperialist heartlands, where we make up some majority local communities. The number one internal priority for Africans, wherever we are in the world, is to come to the understanding that we are Africans, and to put our Africanness before other aspects of our being. To understand who we really are, we must understand our history, i.e., African history, and the various influences on it. Once we put the primacy of Africa first, we will have reached the starting line for achieving African unity and the development of effective African organizations focused on achieving African liberation. Clarification of African identity applying it to the task of addressing the needs of the masses of African people. It is vital that we are able to demonstrate to our people that achieving our Pan-African objective will improve living conditions for the masses of our people. To improve the living conditions of African people en masse, we urgently need a number of things. So, first among those is an end to the exploitation of both Africa and African people. The majority of African people are still in Africa, and Africa is still our center of gravity. The problem confronting our people in our homeland the problems confronting our people in our own homeland are our highest collective priority. Now, with this in mind, what we need from the initial phases of Pan-Africanism are things such as an end to the genocide against African people. The energy of African women brought more fully into all aspects and levels of productive life to help solve our major problems. The energy of African agricultural and industrial workers brought more fully into all aspects and levels of productive life to help solve our major problems. The energy of African youths brought more fully into the Pan-Africanist organization so that they lay the foundation for the future of African liberation and African self-determination. The elimination of poverty from the African experience. An end to the theft of Africa's resources, and I'm talking about the external theft of Africa's resources, but that is increasingly supported by the internal theft by people who are labeled leaders by us. An end to the wanton destruction of Africa's land and environment. We also need to improve the quality of life for the majority of African people. Initially, this means rapid industrialization to facilitate the production of basic amenities for all African people as a matter of priority. Amenities such as clean and easily accessible drinking water, safe, nutritious food, quality healthcare services, quality education services, quality clothing, quality shelter and housing, quality sewerage facilities. It's a crying shame that when you go to Africa, many cities in Africa, you experience raw sewage running through the streets. This is a crying shame. And these are the kinds of initial problems that must be solved in order that our people can see that Pan-Africanism is bringing benefits to them. All of this automatically implies sovereignty, state power and industrialization in Africa under the control of the masses of African people. When African people have a stable environment, their basic needs met, and are sovereign in their own land, the world will begin to see wonders of a caliber never experienced before. Africa will lead humanity into an era of advancement far beyond anything that our minds are currently capable of imagining. This is not to be misinterpreted as a claim that African people are superior to any other people. Rather, it is the recognition of African people's natural advantage of having the richest soil on the planet as the base from which to engage with the world. The element taking account of our people's needs leads to a broadening of the definition of Pan-Africanism as follows. The unification, liberation and development of Africa under a just social system. That just social system being scientific socialism. Now I'm going to continue on for a little bit longer. I'll see how much I can do in the time that is available. And so the next section is 1.43, and it is entitled Giving Meaning to Unity at the Highest Level. Although elements of the two phenomena will happen simultaneously, the unification of Africa and her people is a precondition for her liberation. At the highest material levels, African unity means, number one, the removal of the borders imposed on Africa during the 1884-1885 anti-African Berlin Invasion Conference. 2. The creation of a continental-wide superstate controlled by Africa's agricultural and industrial workers. 3. Unconditional citizenship for all African people historically displaced from Africa. And 4. Industrialization controlled by Africa's agricultural and industrial workers, governed by the principles of humanism, egalitarianism, and collectivism, for advanced production in concert with and not antagonistic to nature. So this is a very important point. When we apply industrialization as African people, we're not applying we will not be applying industrialization in the destructive way that we see capitalism applying it now, European imperialism applying it now. We will be applying it in a way that is in harmony with nature, not in conflict with nature. So our use of technology will be to assist nature, to make nature operate at an even higher level if necessary. And it will not be to pollute nature. It will not be to undermine nature. And our use of new technology will be an advancement for humanity. Now, at the amaterial levels, it has meaning as well. So those were the material levels that I was mentioning. But at the amaterial levels, some people might use the term spiritual. At the amaterial levels, it has meanings as well. And it means, firstly, the coalescing around our African identity to bring us together. Secondly, the practicing and promotion of the principles of African culture in their modern expression to solve our problems. Thirdly, the mastering and applying of African history to solve our problems. And fourthly, developing and implementing our common African objective towards our agreed common African identity. So moving on to section 1.44, the critical importance of the control of state and industrial power. It is not impossible to achieve and sustain the improvements sought above without the achievement of state and industrial power. It is not possible, to achieve and sustain the improvements sought above without the achievement of state and industrial power, united across the entire continent and controlled by African agricultural and industrial workers. Control of state power is of critical importance because in the current phase of history, the most potent tool for controlling land and the power generated from the land is the state. There is something of a tendency for us to bypass the critical importance of state power. However, this myopic response leads us to conducting our analysis of the position of African people in the world without making reference to this fundamentally important structure. The truth is that when we leave the impact of state power out of our analysis, this omission creates a blind spot that virtually guarantees that our analysis will be wrong. Since it is a fact that the state is the most powerful entity within a nation, we cannot ignore it. In any nation, the only potential political entity more powerful than the state is the organized force of the masses of the people united. The problem is that it is not often that the masses of the people in a nation unite to take control of the state. The other critically important element is industrial production. A nation without industrial capacity is not only left behind, but remains at the mercy of those nations that are industrialized. Industrialized nations can invade pre-industrial nations economically or militarily at will, and their general concern will not be the objections of the powerless pre-industrial victim, but other powerful industrial nations that might object. And we see this in Africa. When Libya was invaded, for instance, they were not even bothered with what the other African nations were doing. In fact, they got the other African nations on board to join them in that invasion. But there were concerns of what will the Russians think? What will the Chinese think? Because they're industrial. They have the power to do something about it if they object. Africa, in its unindustrialized state, lacks that power. And they work hard to keep us in a pre-industrial state because they know that they can continue to bully us if they hold us in that condition. No nation can operate fully in the modern world without state apparatus and industrial production. The apparatus of the state and industrial production are in fact a precondition for modern nationhood. In addition to being used to oppress the social classes that do not have state power, the state also unites the citizens in a territory by keeping rogue elements in order. At the same time, industrial production is essential for a modern, heightened standard of living, together with defense of the political gains. In this epoch of history, the apparatus of the state and industrial production are fundamental requirements for the government of any nation. To control the state and industry is to have power to control the nation's destiny. This means that the masses of African people must understand and control both the state and industry in order to achieve freedom. African self-determination is impossible without this. If African masses control state and industrial power, they can do what they need to achieve their interests. By contrast, if they do not, then hostile third parties in control of such power can block them from doing what they need to do and compel them to submit to that third party's will. The objective for African agricultural and industrial workers is clear. They must achieve total control of state and industrial power, united across the entirety of the homeland. That is the African continent. Now, I'm just doing a quick time check, and I will continue for a little while, and thereby creating space for our brother Astamari to come in and do his program. It will be his inaugural program here on Bless Radio, and we do indeed look forward to hearing his contributions. So let's continue. 1.45 areas for action at the local level. The local liberation objective of African people, in this case living in Britain, is much more complex because they form only a tiny minority of Britain's population. The reality is that African people in Britain do not have state power, nor is there any real prospect of them achieving exclusive control of state power in the foreseeable future. It follows that African people in Britain have more of an influencing role in the struggle to achieve state power than an agenda of seeking to control state power itself. Whilst they are objectively African people living in Britain, they are simultaneously parts of differing broader groupings, i.e. African people worldwide and the working class in Britain. Since they have no prospect of achieving state power under their exclusive control, African people living in Britain must provide support to others, of which they are a small constituency, in order to assist them to achieve state power locally. Some of the most critical aspects of their role involve influencing the indigenous population in Britain, as well as their struggling sisters and brothers in Africa and other parts of the diaspora, as well as other oppressed peoples, to seize state power in their various locations. Furthermore, the position of African people in Britain is complicated by the fact that they may be once removed from the calibre of problems confronting their sisters and brothers on the African motherland. Africans in the imperialist heartland, such as Britain, suffer greater levels of oppression than indigenous British working class population, but it is still nowhere near as bad as the calibre of problems suffered by the African masses in the African motherland. Ultimately, African people in Britain can best help themselves by effectively contributing to the solution of African people's problems in the African motherland. Since the British working class continue to be an important element perpetuating the problem of racial oppression. The African motherland represents the African centre of gravity, and when Africa is retrieved, it will be strong. When it is strong, it will be in a position to help its children wherever they are in the world, including Britain. Total liberation is impossible if we do not successfully win back the African motherland, our African motherland. However, African people in Britain do not have the luxury of ignoring the racist oppression that they are directly confronted with in this locality. They must create African liberation orientated organizations in order to equip themselves by systematically struggling here in Britain through community level work supported by revolutionary study programs to ensure 1. Their own survival, 2. An improvement in their collective situation, and 3. Their effective contribution to the overall Pan-Africanist liberation struggle. If African people living in Britain fail to struggle, they will be annihilated. If, on the other hand, they initially struggle for their own survival, confronting the issues that affect them in their own situation with an agenda of improving their collective situations, the process of struggle will raise and heighten their collective consciousness and motivate them to move more firmly towards the higher goal of the liberation of the African motherland, and with it the total liberation of Africa and her people. With these points in mind, the role of the Pan-Africanist organisation in Britain is to recruit large volumes of African people in order to, 1, educate, organise and raise the consciousness of African people in Britain in order for them to do a number of things: defend themselves against the anti-African onslaught in this part of imperialism's heartland, expose and we can do that through exposing and fighting the perpetrators of anti-African racism and institutional racism in Britain. And that includes confronting the state-sponsored terror campaign currently being carried out against African youth. The imposition of the drug economy on African youth. The imposition of racist education on African children. The shorter life expectancy and poor health structurally imposed on the African community. The British state's systematic abuse of African people seeking entry into Britain as asylum seekers or immigrants. Police brutality up to and including the murder of innocent African people. Judicial corruption and bad practices. The overrepresentation of African people among those incarcerated in the penal system. The overrepresentation of African people amongst those incarcerated in mental hospitals. The overrepresentation of African people among homeless and poorly housed people. The overrepresentation of African people among unemployed and those badly treating in the workplace. Exposing and fighting neo-colonial forces is another thing that we must do, both within the African diaspora community here in Britain. This is a major task because what we have are enemy forces here in Britain pretending to be Pan-Africanists, and they must be exposed. There is also the need to fight imperialism's key institutions in Britain, thereby loosening Britain's grip on Africa and contributing to giving African freedom fighters in Africa more space to fight neocolonialism. To stimulate revolution in Britain, which is one of the heartlands of imperialism. This will involve influencing and persuading the indigenous British population to fight and overthrow their oppressive elites. As a stimulus to revolution in Africa, we also need to identify and provide material support to forces genuinely and serious stimulus in Africa to identify and provide material support to forces genuinely and seriously struggling on the neocolonial front line in Africa, with a view to ending the exploitation of Africa and her people, improving the quality of life for African people in Africa, and of course for the purpose of forming links with local and international organizations genuinely fighting against imperialism. Now, I'm going to leave it there for today. I'm delighted to say that we're going to be treated this evening to a program with our brother Astamari. Yes, he will be giving us his first program today.
There are many stages in life.
His first program.
Many dimensions of reality. When someone passes away, is that the end?
It's a good night.
Or is there a continuation of consciousness?
I want to say a big thank
you. The consciousness that transforms and transcends. Remember, there is a divine presence within. A divine presence that is everlasting.
Technical check. I want to.
It's a spiritual vibration. A divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, a different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind, moving down the line, return to the divine. Sad to see them go, but wipe that weeping eye. They are not alone, they have returned to the Most High. Yes, that breath of life that enters you and me returns to the source like a river to the sea. Flesh returns to earth, water turns to water. Essence of thy soul returns to the Creator. Memories will always stay. There's a part of you can never pass away. So hold your head up, hold your head up high. Don't give up, wipe that weeping eye. Just live up, you got to realize there are many stages in life. Wow, 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 wow. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, a different kind of world, a different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind, moving down the line, return to the divine. When a baby is born, the baby starts to cry, thrust into this new world and they don't know why. They've waved the old world bye-bye. A brand new adventure has entered into their lives. Remember the good times and the happiness they give. Deep into your heart they will always live. The good things that you do will surely follow you. Strive for righteousness and you must get through. The body might be gone but the soul it can live on, signaling the start of a brand new dawn. A new concert, a new stage, turning over a new page. So hold your head up, hold your head up high, don't give up. Wipe your weeping eye, just live up. You got to realize there are many stages in life. Why, 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 why?
Vibration, transformation.
It's a spiritual vibration. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, a different kind of mind. Sad to see them go, wipe that weeping eye. They are not alone, they have returned to the Most High. Yes, that breath of life that enters you and me returns to the source like a river to the sea. Flesh returns to earth, water turns to water. Essence of thy soul returns to the Creator. Memories will always stay. There's a part of you can never pass away. So hold your head up, hold your head up high, don't give up. Wipe that weeping eye, just live up. You got to realize there are many stages in life. Why, 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 why? It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. Move to a different kind of time, different kind of world, different kind of mind. It's a spiritual vibration, a divine transformation. They've left their suffering behind,